Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's webinar on epilepsy in the workplace, hosted by Epilepsy South Africa. My name is Jason, and it's a privilege to be with you to help guide our conversation this afternoon. Before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping. You're welcome to use the chat to share reflections or questions as we go, and we'll keep an eye on those, time permitting, and we'll try and open the floor at the end for audience questions. I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording today's webinar and we'll be putting that online on our YouTube channel afterwards. Please keep an eye on our social media for the notifications and link. As we go along, I'm going to be admitting people into the room. It seems I have to do that manually, but let's just get the housekeeping out of the way. So today's session is an important one. Employment is not just about earning a living. It's about dignity, independence, belonging, and the chance to participate fully in society. Yet for many people with epilepsy, the workplace can still be a space filled with uncertainty, misunderstanding, or unnecessary barriers. Our aim today is to shift that. We want to bring clarity, practical guidance, and real-world insights to employers, HR teams, colleagues, and anyone supporting persons with epilepsy. Now, today I'm joined by two remarkable women who both bring professional expertise and lived experience to this table, to the conversation. Let's put it that way. Charlene Castle, our National Director of Epilepsy South Africa, will help us set the scene, grounding us in why this topic matters, what the current challenges look like, how the legal framework in South Africa supports inclusive employment. And as a person with epilepsy herself, with more than 25 years experience in human resources, Charlene is uniquely qualified to speak about this important topic. And of course, Corinne Robinson, our social worker for more than 3 decades and a long-standing advocate for the rights and well-being of persons with epilepsy, who's going to bring her deep experience of working directly with individuals and families, navigating the world of work as persons with disabilities. Charlene is joining us from the cold north, from Johannesburg, and Corinne is kindly joining us from the cold south of the Western Cape in Cape Town. And I'm joining you from Durban, where it's a little bit warmer, so I don't look like I've got lots and lots of warm things on. So together we're going to explore the realities that people with epilepsy face in the workplace, what reasonable accommodation looks like in practice, how disclosure decisions can be approached with confidence, and what employers can do starting today to create safer, more supportive environments. Our hope is that you're going to leave the session not only with be better informed, but also better equipped to take the necessary action in your own workplaces and communities. Now, with that, let's get started. Charlene, I'm handing it over to you to set the scene for us.
So hi, everybody, and welcome today. It's always wonderful to speak about this important topic and to be engaging with you as National Director of Epilepsy South Africa. It really is my privilege to be here today and speak about a topic that I get asked a lot about and I spend a lot of time discussing, really, really pertinent in a landscape today where over 50% of our South African population statistically are actually unemployed. So I think the very first port of call for a mixed audience is to say, what is this invisible disability? What is this neurological disorder? And even as I start there and say, the terminology we use to describe epilepsy varies from what sector we're addressing. So if you're talking to a neurologist or a medical practitioner, they'll talk about epilepsy, the disease or the illness. The correct advocacy terminology is neurological disorder or neurological condition as per the World Health Organization. So what is epilepsy? So number one, we're going to talk about it being a neurological condition. And let's be very clear. The things that epilepsy is not, it's not a mental illness. It's not contagious. I can't touch you and you get my epilepsy or you are contaminated by me. These are things we'll talk later on in our webinar as we go on. But my biggest thing right now is to tell you what is epilepsy. Epilepsy is a heightened electrical current that surges through the brain. And the easiest way I always explain it to anybody is person without epilepsy, imagine yourselves putting your finger in a plug and you get that electrical shock and you pull away because it's so sore. We can physically see you in pain. We can physically see you experiencing it. What happens with epilepsy? That current surges through one of the lobes in the brain. That lobe goes into spasm. It's an abnormal spasm, and it pushes that lobe will go into a seizure as we know it as being called. Now, one seizure does not mean you have epilepsy. Epilepsy is recurrent seizures, more than 2 seizures, and they typically vary from person to person. So some seizures like I have a number of the different types of seizures. I have what you will know as a tonic-clonic or a grand mal seizure as we used to know them. And that's when you actually, as a person with epilepsy, you will fall, you stiffen, your eyes roll back, you lose control of yourself. You may wet yourself. It really is an embarrassing thing to happen. Happened countless times to me. But it's always about the people around me that make me safe, that bring me back, that are with me. And we'll talk a bit about first aid. The other seizures that we know and that you're probably familiar with, but are the unseen ones, where somebody loses minutes or seconds of a conversation. We call these partial seizures, absent seizures, petit mal seizures. And they seem to be the seizures where somebody may say, oh, she's not listening to me, or she's tuning out, or she does. Those are those small, sharp, small seizures that occur. So that's a number, just a small overview of what epilepsy is. But what matters for people with epilepsy in the workplace? And that's why we're here today. So really, it is about dignity. It is about economic independence for you. It's not about charity. Today, I read a frightening statistic that 8 out of 10 people with a disability globally remain marginalized by employment, that battle to find jobs. Now, if you look at that in the context of South Africa, it gets even more scary. So being employed as a person with epilepsy, what does it do? It reduces one's isolation. It reduces the likelihood of mental health decline, mental health depression, and all the different mental health issues. It enables financial independence. And this independence is so critically important. One of the things I hold very dear to myself as a person with epilepsy is being able to do things for myself and not needing supervision all the time. And I am a medical miracle. I have had countless seizures. And as a person with epilepsy, and as high functioning as I am, and I've had a really privileged career to have worked in corporate, to have worked in private sector, in education. And today I serve in the NPO sector in a invisible disability organization. So employment, it's not a magic fix for stigma, colleagues. It's not, but exclusion from employment will harden that stigma, will harden that exclusion. So today, we really need to be giving you the skills to go away and be able to have this conversation with people in your life and in your workplace. We need to be talking about this. We need to be open about it. One of the topics that I often get asked is about disclosure. Now, we'll touch on this more later in the webinar, and we'll certainly touch against the legislation that sits behind reasonable accommodation and employment of a person with epilepsy. But some of the challenges with disclosure is that at what point and when do you disclose to your employer? Are you obliged to? What happens if you disclose and then there's discrimination or unfair dismissal? All those are really important points. But what I want to say to you is that as much as it's the responsibility of your employer, of yourself to disclose, it's the responsibility of your employer to create a safe environment, to create an inclusive environment where various disabilities, whichever type of disability is in the workplace, can be accepted, integrated and included in the very essence and fabric of the culture of that workplace, that there is no discrimination. So there's no safe middle ground in most South Africa workplaces yet, which is quite sad. And some of the workplace assumptions are you can't manage the stress. Regardless of the low impact or high impact, that's something people will say. Oh, you have epilepsy, you can't manage the stress, you'll have seizures, you'll miss too much work. And these are the things that's important for you, and not to stigmatize yourself. I was in a wonderful Indaba last year, and one of the ladies in the audience with epilepsy put her hand up and she said, I just want to say to you, I place more stigma on myself than anyone else does. And that kind of hit me really hard, because it made me stop and go, well, as much as I'm telling people about stigma and addressing it, how much of that stigma I'm putting on my own self by going, doubting myself, having a lack of confidence, and all those unseen behaviors and thoughts that go along with living with epilepsy or having epilepsy. So what I want to do is that's really just an overview that I'd like to touch on today, and just opening the webinar. I've given you so many different points, but the importance of the inclusive workplace, I cannot emphasize enough. So allow talent to have access to your organization, enable capability to be added to your workplace, help with retention. Look at retention of persons with disabilities, but invisible disabilities is a real difficult one for companies and organizations. And that's the importance of these conversations, to help you get more understanding and allow that cultural spillover inclusion. I can't reiterate that enough. So I think I could talk for so long about this. We've got so many more beautiful additions to what I'm saying by Karen, by Jason, further engagement with Karen and I, a blend of experience. So I'm going to just let Jason continue here. And let's jump into, let's hear from Karen. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you so much, Charlene. You're so right on those points. And I think that leads me to my first question to you, Karen. Many people with epilepsy are concerned about finding or keeping employment. From your experience as a social worker, what are some of the biggest challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, and also welcome to everyone. And I'm also very excited to be part of this very important discussion today. So I think from a social work perspective, what I've learned, and I think Charlene, and in your introduction, you've also mentioned it, that employment is much more than earning an income, whether you have a disability or you don't have a disability. I think work, we know, provides us, purpose, dignity, independence, social interaction, and just a sense of belonging. Because where do we spend most of our time? At work. And I think when we come to, when people experience barriers to employment, we know that the impact it goes beyond financial hardship. It goes to whereby it affects your confidence, your self-esteem, your mental health, and also your hope for the future. And from my work, working with people with epilepsy as a social worker, I think one of the greatest challenges people with epilepsy often face is not epilepsy itself, but the stigma and the misconceptions surrounding epilepsy. And, a lot of people would share when they do reach out is that they are worried if they are going to disclose, that they have epilepsy or any other or it could be any other, disability, that they may not be employed. They may lose opportunities for promotion. They may be treated differently by the employer and or their colleagues. And these fears goes in whereby it creates anxiety before they even start, a job. So this is still I feel there's still a great deal of misunderstanding about epilepsy. And many people, if we look within the workplace, assume that everyone with epilepsy experience the same type of seizures, or that if you have epilepsy, it means that you cannot work safely, and this taps into the myths and misconceptions about epilepsy. But in reality, epilepsy, I just want to say, affects every or each person differently. And many people, as Charlene is an example of that, can actually work successfully. They can manage their condition. They can work productively in a variety of careers. So as social workers, and I see some of my colleagues is also online, they can also resonate with what I'm saying, is that we often see the emotional impact of repeated rejection or discrimination, and you begin to question your abilities, you lose your confidence, and sometimes you even withdraw from wanting to seek employment altogether. And then lastly, what I want to say is that's why platforms like this, and why the organization like Epilepsy, why awareness and education is so important. Because when employers understand epilepsy, they will begin to focus on the person's abilities, their skills, their experiences, rather than the assumption about the disability.
Thank you, Karen. And you're raising some incredibly valuable points there. Not the least of which is the responsibility and role of employers. And I'm sure that in our audience we have either employers or HR managers, which leads me to ask Charlene, what legal protections exist for persons with a disability, especially with epilepsy, but for persons with disability, we have very good legislation here in South Africa. How is this affecting, or how is this supporting persons with epilepsy?
So Jason, yeah, thanks. I think we need to take a step back and go, from an international instrument, we've got the UN CRPD, which is the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And every country globally adopted the UN CRPD. And today we've got the white paper with reference to for persons with disabilities. And from that white paper, above that is our constitution. And if we look at section 9 of our constitution, it talks to equality and dignity and prohibition of discrimination based on disability. Now, if we take that from the constitution, we then see that then goes from the white paper. We've got a number of legislations like the legislative mechanisms, and we then talk to the Employment Equity Act. And the Employment Equity Act is very, very clear. Employers must take steps to promote equal opportunity and treat people with disabilities equally. Now, that talks into the Employment Equity Act, which covers an employee with labor practice, best practice for your employer and your employee. We've got a very sound governance structure. We then have the Code of Good Practice, and in the Code of Good Practice, employers must provide reasonable accommodation unless it causes undue hardship. So we have the layers in place, and then added to that, remember this wonderful mechanism we have called the POPI Act. And employers cannot ask invasive health questions during hire, and you have to protect health data. And this is a very contentious, difficult one, because when a person applies for a role and discloses they have a certain disability, are they discriminated by the recruiter that doesn't really know about those types of disabilities and is all those mandated to give preference to persons with disabilities when they see an invisible disability, they don't understand the detail and how to accommodate that. So we're starting right from the beginning of the value chain. And I think when you look at that, it is so important that that recruiter of the organization is upskilled and educated. When a company is saying, we want to attract this type of disability, and some organizations are better equipped to deal with a certain disability than others. So know as employers what disability and what inclusive, reasonable accommodation you can offer and ensure that you're aligned with your disability inclusion employment agenda. So if you look at what reasonable accommodation actually means, and it works, it leads in terms of the frameworks that I've said straight into that going, what is the reasonable accommodation or the work arrangement that enables that person with epilepsy to participate fully and be set up for success in the workplace. So as an example, you need to have X amount of medical checkups to go for one of your blood tests or an MRI or an EEG, whatever it is. Those are not sick days. Those are essential checkups to monitor and measure and look at your medication and assess where your epilepsy is. So these are the types of things, and these are governed by the legal instruments. And employers and employees must take heed and look at their rights and understand how to implement it. It is not a rod to slap your back, to hit you on the back. It is sound governance with many expert minds that have stood behind these mechanisms to look after and ensure an inclusive workplace for everybody. Thanks, Jason. Jason, you are on mute.
Look at me pushing buttons in the background. You know, I think it takes us to a really, really important conversational topic here for both yourself, Charlene, and Corin. You know, disclosure is I think it's often one of the most difficult decisions for employees with epilepsy to make. When we talk about disclosure, is effectively telling your employer that you have epilepsy. I know that I was talking to a medical colleague a couple of years ago, and they said that a good 80%, in other words, a good 8 out of 10 people that are diagnosed with epilepsy choose not to disclose that diagnosis, often with friends and family, which is really difficult in itself, but then the schools, and then we get to the employment side. So disclosure being such a difficult decision, let's unpack that for a moment.
Okay, I think I will start. I think for me, firstly, I think when we look at disclosure, there's one thing that we should remember, that disclosure is not just simply like an employment decision. I think it's an emotional decision. And I'm saying that as social workers. We also recognized, or we need to know that, you know, when someone is got a diagnosis of epilepsy, that has got a significant amount of impact. So I'm speaking from that perspective. So this person is trying to understand, you know, what does this diagnosis means? They need to adjust to medication. They still need to continue with their daily lives. And in most cases, they are a breadwinner in their family. And then having to come, you know, to terms with, you know, what future, you know, it's like a grieving process. Many of you, I've shared this previously also. So I think during this time, people, you know, people with epilepsy, you know, when we work with them as social workers, we must know, like I said, it's a grieving process. So they're not ready to discuss the diagnosis with others, including their employer. And we need to acknowledge that. It's a process to move from I've been diagnosed and then to accept, you know, your diagnosis. And just reflecting on that, there was one young uh, gentleman that I supported. I think he was in his early 20s, just to share. And he was recently diagnosed, and he was working in, let's just say, telecommunications sector. And he chose not to disclose his diagnosis immediately, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he was still trying to accept his diagnosis himself. He was adjusting to medication, they were seeking a second opinion, and for him, just trying to find out, you know, what does this mean to me now that I've been diagnosed? Unfortunately, I remember, you know, he shared that he had a seizure at work, and this is how people found out that he has epilepsy. And then was called in, was asked, you know, why did you not disclose? He tried to explain, you know, recently diagnosed, I'm still coming to terms with everything. And then he just said, you know, after that, the whole workplace atmosphere changed. His colleagues started to treat him differently. His work patterns, he was on day shift, all of a sudden he's getting all the night shifts. And then eventually he got so discouraged, he felt unsupported, at work.
Mm.
And he just waited until payday and then decided not to return to work. That is the reality out there. But it must remind us, the question, it sounds a very easy question to answer, but it's actually not.
Mm.
It's not a simple decision for a person who's got epilepsy, because there's often a personal journey that is taking place behind the scenes that employers may not see. So my advice would be that there is no single right answer, and that disclosure is a very personal decision. And it should, I think, take into account the person's circumstances, the nature of their work, the workplace culture, and then also, safety considerations, and whether reasonable accommodation may be needed. So that's just from my interaction. And
Sure.
I just lastly want to say, employers also, like Charlene has mentioned, this has got a role in creating a workplace culture that is inclusive,
Yes.
where people are feeling safe, whether you have epilepsy or not. But I feel safe to have these conversations in my workplace, and without any fear that I'm going to be judged, that I'm going to be discriminated against. So that's why I feel when trust exists, disclosure becomes less frightening.
Absolutely. That barrier to friction goes away. But I mean, we need to see a change. You mentioned workplace culture, where employers need to start understanding this isn't a hindrance or a chore that they've got to fulfill. This is a human being that adds value to their organization. That's why they were hired. But let's talk about disclosure from the opposite side of the equation. Charlene, if you can play devil's advocate for a moment, let's talk about why disclosure at work actually is quite important, practically speaking.
Jason, I'm going to discuss that right now. But what I want to just jump on and jump back to something Karen said is because I was in corporate and I never disclosed that I had epilepsy. And it is like Corin's saying, it's a difficult one. Because when you do disclose your own fears of what is the consequence of it going to be, how are people going to react? And it was only about 14 years ago, and I've had epilepsy since I was 8, and I've had a real long journey with epilepsy over 4 decades. And it's been a journey of self-discovery. It's been a journey of experiencing being separated out. It's been a really, really hard journey, but it's one that's also made me who I am today, with a high enough EQ to go, I'm bold enough, I'm courageous enough. And I started speaking 14 years ago about my epilepsy, and somebody asked me in a Toastmasters meeting, they said to me, Charlene, tell us one thing that we don't know about you. And there I was standing in a room of 25 people that I knew. Some of them were strangers, but I had to take a really big breath, and I had to go, sure, something you don't know about me. I am a person with epilepsy. And I just poured my heart out. And, I look back and I go, what was one of the moments that have got me to this point? And I salute my parents, because at 8 years of age, my parents were told I had to go to a special needs school, and it was non-negotiable. And my parents stood up and said, no, Charlene will be included wherever we can include her, and she will be given every opportunity and all the support she needs to have a mainstream education. And I'm very grateful for that, because although I battled at times, my exam papers were blank, when I went into the workplace, I also understood inclusion. So I was able to, although I didn't disclose myself, I was able to stand up for other people. I was able to contribute to create that inclusive space. And when I did start talking, I took the responsibility on myself to educate people about my epilepsy. Don't give me 18-hour days because I'm going to have seizures.
Yeah.
Don't set me up in an environment, in a room where there are so many flashing lights and I've got photosensitive epilepsy and I'm going to have seizures. And yes, I may have a seizure at work, but do you have the first aid in place? Can you save my life? Are the first aiders on hand? So I really educated my workplaces the last 14 years, and I've made it a mission of mine. And I encourage everybody, as an employer on the other side, when someone discloses, make sure, like Karen spoke about, that that person is able to be included correctly. What does that mean? If there is fear, you've heard Karen, there is natural fear around something that a person doesn't understand. And it is human nature. To employers, I implore you, make it your mission to understand invisible disabilities. Make it your mission. Today, we are standing here as Epilepsy South Africa. We have got a plethora of resources on our website. Make it your obligation to download them, share it through your organization. It's going to cost you nothing. And as I say, employers, if you have a diversity and inclusion team, scope them up that they know when somebody comes to them and says, I'd like to discuss, what does that look like in your organization? Can that confidentiality be just broken? No, it can't. There needs to be embedding of the POPI Act, of the different acts. But even more than that, there's the human-to-human connection. So if you look at, Jason said, I come from a leadership space in HR prior to the NPO sector. And, you know, your HR strategy has 5 different pillars, and you need to include your disability policy and inclusion of diversity within your policies, and then make those policies come alive within the culture. There's a lot of work to be done. If you have a broken culture in this regard, focus on it.
And sadly, that is quite widespread. I just want to acknowledge that we have hands in the room and some questions. So we see you. Please may I ask you to use the chat facility to type in your question so we can manage it accordingly there, because we are quite spaced for time. So please, if you don't mind, by all means, use the chat or the Q&A so we can come to that. You know, we are addressing some of the concerns in the room, I think, that have come up, but there's a term that we keep using, and I must admit, I only recently started to appreciate what it actually meant, because I've got a background in the tourism sector. So when you refer to reasonable accommodation, I'm thinking you're giving me a nice place to stay. But in the workplace environment, reasonable accommodation means something else. Can we talk to that now?
Of course we can. Karen, off you go. We got lots to say, Jason.
I just think, yeah, from my side, and Charlene can also touch on that, is that one of the strengths I when it comes to reasonable accommodation, and it doesn't refer to you like your accommodation needs to be where you're staying. I think it's the fact that it is individualized. And this is what makes it so, my English, but it's beautiful. I don't know what other English word to use, is that you. And for people with epilepsy, if there's any HR or employers that's on here, it's actually very easy to give them, a reasonable or to make reasonable accommodation. Like Charlene mentioned earlier on, working hours, like working maybe as like long hours, that can be an issue. If you've got photosensitive epilepsy, maybe the lighting, where you are sitting, those type of things, we can adjust, or your laptop that you're using. And I think, and also when I said it's you need to individualize, and it comes back to where you're basically sitting down and asking that person, because you can't make assumptions. What works for you? How can we within this department, accommodate you reasonably? Because for two people with epilepsy, they may have totally different support needs. So your starting point for me when it comes to reasonable accommodation is always, have your conversation with the employee rather than making, assumptions based on the person's disability or neurological disorder. Charlene, I don't know if you want to add just something on that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things is know what you need. Know what you need as reasonable accommodation. Like for me, I wouldn't like to be working in an environment with concrete floors. I'm very blessed, and I say this not lightly, that I have auras. So I have about 30 seconds or 15 to 20 to 30 seconds, different sensations or tastes in my mouth or on my arms. I might see little freckles or speckles that I know a seizure is coming. So if I'm working in an environment with a solid concrete floor, I know I'm going to be unsafe if I have a seizure, because I'm going to need something under my head to cushion and protect me when I do have a seizure, and I put myself in the safety position. If you're working around machinery, make sure that there's a safety mechanism in place. A huge one for a person with epilepsy is sleep. I always say, if you have a certain type of epilepsy, or any epilepsy, you must make sure you get 8 hours sleep a night or a day, but preferably a night, because that is when you can get into REM sleep, true REM sleep, when your brain can actually heal and restore itself. The steady routine is really important. And ensuring that if you are on long shifts, that you have rest periods. And if you do have a seizure, make sure there's reasonable accommodation for recovery. One grand mal seizure takes 4 weeks to recover from neurologically, and that's fact. So don't expect your employee, when they come back to work, to come back firing on all cylinders. They might get a bit more tired than usual. I experienced that. Their focus might not be 100%. I've experienced that. Concentration, engagement's not as alert. It's not to say none of those are there. It just means there's recovery time, and that needs accommodation, not performance management, not first written warnings. You have to take it in context of, this is how the person was at work just before the seizure, and what are we actually seeing in these next days. So in the employer space, in the workplace, that's the type of accommodation. Be conscious, be careful, and really it requires a level of engagement. If you put me around flashing lights, I will have seizures. It's not even a question. So yeah, that are some of the things I can really speak about a lot. And what I would really, I would encourage you is, we've got a resource called Reasonable Accommodation on our website. It's relevant, it's freshly checked against all the legislation, the content's correct, it's beautiful. Download it and use it and make reference to it. It really will add value to each of you.
Thank you, Charlene. And you know, one of the realities is, despite legal protections, we do know that employees are being either directly or indirectly put out of employment or discouraged from taking up employment, because for some reason, a very human reason, I suppose, employers or those in the position of hiring don't want the problem of having to deal with disability. There's that stigma is very true for both the seen disability and the unseen disability. But there are benefits to having a person with epilepsy in your company, and let's speak about why should employers employ a person with a disability?
Either of us?
Sure. Karen, let's start with you. From a social worker
Karen.
point of view,
Yeah.
what value is that person going to be bringing to the organization? Then we can go into the legal side.
Yeah, I think, look, when we look within the workplace, like I said, people need to look at not at the person's disability. So if we're recruiting, the first thing that or if we appoint people within the workplace, we appointing them because of they submitting a CV, like if we're talking when you apply, you're submitting. So they need to look at the person's, qualifications, experiences, that they're bringing to the table, because there's obviously requirements. I think that should be, I said it earlier on, when someone has got a disability, whether it's epilepsy or any other disability, it's the same for me. You look at what the person is bringing to the table. And if a person, you're asking for benefits, if a person, I feel, when people, especially people with disability, if we look at, the resilience, they bring those type of things also, having been stigmatized and discriminated. And sometimes you end up with people because when they enter a workplace, their self-esteem might be very low, some might be very high, where they can advocate for themselves. And I've seen that. And I think that's why it's also very important when we look at workplaces. You have I don't know, some workplaces, especially corporate, are blessed in the fact that they may have wellness programs. So I mean, those people, and also if you've got teams that works within diversity, for me, it's also just stepping into the person's strengths. Because if someone discloses, because there are people that goes and take the leap of faith and disclose that I have a disability, to embrace that and to acknowledge that it's not easy for anyone to disclose, that I have a disability, knowing the implications. So there's lots of, benefits. I'm not going to, Charlene can also add on with regards, having someone, with a disability on your team, because we're working within a diverse, I think, workplace also environment. So, and like I said, that person also, besides these skills and experiences, has been through a lot. So I feel they're also very resilient and can be very supportive. Like Charlene shared her story that she didn't disclose, but she was an advocate for other people. And she was the one, that will also make sure that she would educate the workplace, people around. So it's in that same context, I would say, based from my experiences, that I would see that, the roles that people take within the workplace.
Absolutely. I think, a person that's motivated is going to provide the value to the workplace. A person who's not won't. Charlene.
The global phrase, the global slogan in the disability sector is nothing about us without us. And it is not about, if you, gone are the days where you have a person with a disability standing at the door, advising from the door, or being thought of as an afterthought in the workplace. If you don't have persons with disabilities at the table, you are not being an inclusive society and an inclusive workplace. The only way that you're going to understand true inclusion for persons with epilepsy, as that's what we're talking about today, is to have that person and those people at the table to be talking. You cannot talk on our behalves. And having a transformed organization is today non-negotiable. It's inexcusable if you don't, because you're not celebrating diversity. What does a person with a disability bring to the workplace? I think everybody brings a uniqueness to the workplace, and I think that needs to be focused on. Does our place of employment need lots of education? Absolutely. As Epilepsy South Africa, we work with the Department for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities extensively. We do a lot of engagement with different government departments where we are educating, we are sharing. Our president has mandated that 3% of government has to now achieve that quota for the employment of persons with disabilities within government. So it is very, very high up on the agenda. We are lagging with education. We are not lagging with legislation. We are lagging with advocacy and with having the right levels of advocacy and conversations in different environments. And my encouragement to every one of you, if you've got a person, not if, you have someone with epilepsy in your workplace, because today there's 50 million people globally with epilepsy according to World Health, and that's only that are known. In Africa, there are many, many more. We think 1 in 20 people have epilepsy in Africa. It is that tight. The worst case is 1 in 100. So if you know someone with epilepsy, you are going to have a minimum of 10 or 20 people affected by epilepsy. Epilepsy and stroke are two of the most known invisible disabilities and the most prevalent. one of the questions was sick leave in the workplace, and really it needing to be looked at. I think that's when that comes to being employed as a person with epilepsy, it's something upfront you need to discuss, and you need to disclose and say, I need special days for X, Y, and Z. Because if we are not disclosing as people with epilepsy, how can we possibly expect somebody just to understand and just to change? We can't, colleagues. So both ways, the conversation has to go from the employee to the employer and back again. Thanks, Jason. I love this topic. I can talk forever on this.
And you know, because it's so emotive on so many different ways. We're talking a lot as persons with epilepsy. You have touched on the fact that other people are affected as well. It can be family members, colleagues, friends, who are either there in a supportive role or are in the dark. They don't know enough about epilepsy to understand what they can do to try and be supportive. One of the go-tos as a human being is you feel some degree of empathy about the other person. And with empathy and a lack of understanding can come where the stigma comes in. It's that fear of stepping back and going, I'm not quite sure what I'm dealing with here. I'm hoping that our audience, regardless of which side of the employment divide, if we want to call it that, they're sitting on, are starting to appreciate not just the complexity, but also the simplicity of the story that we're telling them, that reasonable accommodation is achievable without going to great extremes. And you know, I think it's important right now to acknowledge the hard work that Epilepsy South Africa is in fact doing in this public space, because we talk about policy and a lack of understanding and education, and it takes a lot to mobilize it. I'm going to use this analogy. It takes a lot to move a rhino, but when that rhino gets going, it gets going. So can we talk about SINAP? Charlene.
Of course. And SINAP, colleagues, is not the synapses in your body that connects everything. But that's where the name came from. We were looking at the Intersectoral Global Action Plan, which is a World Health Organization ratified document in 2022. And the importance of that document is that we've now brought it into South Africa. We've localized it into South Africa. It's going to Cabinet later this year to be approved in Cabinet, and that means implementation from government. The South African Intersectoral National Action Plan on Epilepsy and other neurological disorders addresses all the various aspects of persons with epilepsy and the requirements, and from access to healthcare, from stigma to carers, to education, to research. There's a number of pillars that SINAP, as we've come to know it, addresses. And I think what's really relevant for each and every one of you to know is this is not only a civil society driven action plan that's going to Cabinet. All the stakeholders, intersectoral. And if you'd like to see a full presentation on SINAP, I think there is one that is on our YouTube channel that I have done. It's available to explain lots more. But when I say intersectoral, National Department of Health, the National Department of Social Development, the Department for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities from the President's Office, Wits University, and ourselves sit on a national government working group where we are taking the intersectoral plan through the processes to Cabinet to get approved. And the action plan will impact every person with epilepsy in South Africa, and it's the first of its kind. So it's been implemented already from the grassroots of civil society, of all the organizations working with neurological disorders, right through into the government space. And the more hands on deck in the implementation, the more and the far reaching and the changes can be achieved. So SINAP is a turning point document. It's been 5 years in its making, and truly it's an action plan for me that is just something I'm so proud of what that action plan is calling for. And each of the stakeholders that I mentioned are committed and listed and named in the action plan and have committed to the areas of responsibility. So very, very exciting document to really take heed of, employers, to really, if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to engage us as workplaces, as Epilepsy South Africa, please reach out to us. We do a lot of education in the workplace. And there's a lot more information that we can share today, from today with you, making relevant to your organization. But so the South African Intersectoral National Action Plan really gives us that roadmap of creating an inclusive society for persons with epilepsy in all regards. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. I have put into the chat a link to our website, and that is epilepsy.org.za/resources. And we're encouraging you to go to epilepsy.org.za to explore not just understanding epilepsy, but the organization itself. But the resources page is really what's going to benefit this conversation right now, starting with reasonable accommodation for persons with epilepsy in the workplace. This document is extensive. A tremendous amount of work has gone into it, and that allows you to speak to the subject both as an employee and as an employer or an HR practitioner or a manager. Alongside that is also a very useful resource called Making the Invisible Visible. And Charlene and Karen and myself have worked quite a bit along with other colleagues. This is really important. In the chat, we acknowledge, Tsegofatso, you've made a very valuable point there in terms of whether you're working for a state company or a private institution, whether you're listening to this webinar now live or possibly a recording later on, you might be working in a garage as a mechanic. You might be a bricklayer. The level of your work is not what's important here. What is important is that you are seen. And if you have epilepsy, when you have epilepsy as a diagnosis, that you are confident enough to disclose that to your employer. We're hoping that the resources that we have been developing are going to assist you in doing that. Karen, as we start to wrap up, I know that we are very tight for time, and I know that there's lots of questions that people do want to answer. But as a social worker, as a person who's worked on the ground with persons with epilepsy and disabilities, what is your feeling about the resources that are currently available to that person?
I think the resources that we have available, on our website is quite relevant. And I think from our side, from National Office side, it's for me also, it's based on, what people were telling National Office and also from the branches, what they would like us to focus on. So I feel it's also needs-based. People are telling us this is what we want. And I think like you said, National Office is still busy reviewing and always updating, which is something positive. And the resources is there. And like we said, one of the misunderstandings or the stigma that's there is because people do not know. So there you have, Jason has put the link in there. So you do have access to that information and to share. Even if you're not if you don't feel comfortable to share I have epilepsy, I have disability at this moment, you have access to information that can allow you to advocate for yourself in your own way or to advocate for someone else also, because epilepsy is not, it impacts on not just the person, but like we said, it impacts holistically on a lot of systems that we are actually involved with on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
As we're starting to close to time, and I'm renowned for keeping time in the organization, but I can I ask you in closing statements, if you could leave employers with one key message from this, and this is a message that I'm hoping employees can take to their employers, what would that message be? Karen, if I can start with you.
Okay. I think I've said it before, but I think, what I would like, if I could leave one final thought from my perspective, is I shared earlier, employment is not just about earning. It's about, we know that we all know when we work, it gives us dignity, independence, the social connection, the sense of belonging. So it contributes to our personal identity, to our well-being. And throughout the discussion, we spoke about legislation, reasonable accommodation, disclosure, stigma, and all of these are important. But I believe that the key message is that from a social work perspective is we need to see the whole person and
Yes.
not just their
Yeah.
disability. Every person has got strengths, they've got skills, they've got aspirations, they've got the everyone has got the ability to make a meaningful contribution to society. So the responsibility of employers, of colleagues, of professionals, and even the society is we need to remove the barriers, because that's why I think, for me, if I think about reasonable accommodation, is about removing those barriers, and that will create opportunities. It will build workplaces where people are recognized for their abilities rather than their disability. And I think also, just lastly, we've been speaking about this, create inclusive workplaces.
Mm.
It does not require major changes. Like
Mm.
I said, often it's just about understanding, listening, having respectful communication, about being willing to ask, how can we support you to succeed? Very basic like that. And lastly, you see, I'm also as bad. I can talk a lot. So lastly, I also want to use this opportunity for employers is to also encourage you that Corporate Wellness Week is coming within the next week or so, first 1 to 5 July. So please start the conversations about epilepsy, about neurological disorders in the workplace. We are here, like Charlene has said, you've got national office, you've got the branches, so that we can start, also invite us to do awareness sessions, seizure first aid training, and also discussions about inclusion, and how and practical ways how we can reduce stigma. And then by this, we are creating environments where employees will feel safe, respected, and supported. And I thank you.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. And I've dropped my email into the chat, marketing@epilepsy.org.za, that employers and companies can reach out, especially on that Corporate Wellness Day. Charlene, as I know that there are people that are itching to also discuss things, so I'm encouraging them to reach out to us by email. There will be a recording of this webinar afterwards. We're going to put it up on our YouTube channel. But and also, I did notice, just as a last point, there is an interest in other kinds of webinars, which I'm quite positive we are going to engage with quite proactively. But Charlene, your parting message to employers and, of course, to the audience today?
So number one, yes, Corin, thank you for me mentioning Corporate Wellness Week. Really, really important. Please get hold of us and we can support you. I think my message to employers is, when you look at your organization, everybody is driving a diversity and inclusion portfolio within the HR space in companies today. And that diversity and inclusion department should be creating what we call masterclasses internally, where there's a good curriculum, that there's monthly educational systems, and also that space of masterclasses is where Epilepsy South Africa can support you. With our team, that's the various teams, our experts that could join you to do those sessions. In addition to that, as employers, you can create disability forums where once a month you have 3 or 4 panelists. There are a number and access to amazing speakers externally. We can certainly help you with that. There's no reason why internally you don't have one or 2 or 3 of your staff that have a disability, an invisible disability or epilepsy, that are courageous enough to stand up and say on a panel, this is me and this is how it affects me and this is what I need. Those are some structures as employers that I implore you to look at internally. It doesn't take a lot of work. There are a lot of partners that can partner with you with a deep curriculum, deep knowledge, deep expertise. We can't be everything to everybody, but there's certainly, we can enable capacity for you. So I can just say to each of you that are employed, please be brave enough to disclose. Please give your voices for that voiceless population. And that's something I always say. It's emotionally very difficult. And I've taken a lot of strain through the years when I sit in the role I do and I say to you, this is me in my rawness. It's not easy for me to share my story with you, but my role is to say, it is possible. I am at the table. I am influencing conversations, and that's why I'm here. And be bold enough to take that space in with your employers. Be bold enough not to stand at the door, but to say, don't make decisions for me. Listen to me, ask me, and that includes every person with a disability in the workplace. Jason, Karen, thank you for having me today, and it's lovely being with every single one of you that's joined. And yes, it's just wonderful to be with each of you, and we will answer as many of your questions as we can. Keep them coming, and there is a lot of information all over, so get hold of us. We would love to hear from you. Thank you, Jason.
Super. Good people, thank you very much for joining us here at Epilepsy South Africa this afternoon as we unpacked epilepsy in the workplace. As you've heard, it's both a very sensitive and a very important conversation to be had. It involves two sides of a very important equation, employers and employees, and it is not something that we can solve in 1 hour. But I'd like to believe we've covered a great deal of ground today. Most importantly, visit our website, www.epilepsy.org.za. In the chat, we've answered as many as we can and encouraged you to reach out. There are a number of ways that we as an organization can support you. Ladies, have a wonderful day further. Colleagues, as you're going home, be safe, be warm tonight. God bless everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.